Hello and welcome to this updating event. My name is Richard Stowe and I'm the Managing Director here at Weed Free Limited, and we're delighted to be the lead sponsor of this year's updating events. Weed Free has been an active member and supporter of the Amenity Forum for 12 years. We are a basis amenity assured contractor specialising in railway weed control. Our core staff all hold both railway and pesticide competencies, allowing us to apply herbicides to the rail network here in the UK, both by hand and from rail-borne machines. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that we do here at Weed Free, please feel free to give me a call. These updating events are an ideal opportunity for the Amenity Forum to reach out to potential new members, raise awareness and share industry updates and regulatory changes. I hope you enjoy today and find this event both useful and informative. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to John to introduce the first speaker. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you've got the presentation on the screen. As you probably heard, we were expecting a few more. Hopefully they will join, but if not, we've got a good select group today, so that will be quite useful for discussion. But I do think it highlights a particular issue, which is that the forum has good, strong links in Scotland, Wales, and in England. But I've got to be honest, we do struggle in Northern Ireland, and I think it is something that we certainly need to work on. So if those who are here that are involved with Northern Ireland, you are very, very welcome. And we are in discussions with the government there about how we can actually get better engagement with the forum as we move forward. Right. I'm very aware that many of you know quite a bit about the forum and what we do, but first of all, if I can just say thank you again to Weed Free, who have provided the sponsorship for all our events this year and last year. We had to sort of stop the program last year halfway through, but we are grateful for Weed Free for that. We're also grateful to ICL, who are very strong supporters of the forum, who are supporting this particular event, but support the forum in many ways, and not least in terms of the Amenity Spray Operator of the Year awards. We had to put them on hold last year, but this year they're back again. And they will be, I think, formally announced next week, but we'll be looking for entrants. And in true spirit of the new world we live in, I think there's going to be video interviewing and all kinds of things. So basically, please do put your name forward. We're grateful to ICL and to Syngenta, who actually support those events. So you know where you are today. The reason we give it a Northern Ireland focus is that basically, as I say, as we've gone round these events, we've been trying to give a particular emphasis in things we say and do, and each country has a slight variation. We've had something like 200 people so far on the events. Now, when we run them in actual, we probably would be saying about now we've had about 250, 260. So basically, I think it shows that this mechanism can work. And the next event will be on the 4th of March, and that has a Scottish focus, and it will have an introduction from the minister, government minister, in terms of that event. Now, as I say, looking at who's in attendance here, some of this is all very familiar to people, but I couldn't have a presentation that I do without my penknife, because it's when I started this, or got involved with the amenity sector about 11 years ago, it was very helpful for me because I was trying to get my head around what amenity was, and I use this a lot. And you'll be glad to hear that I was in discussion with somebody at DEFRA only recently, and they sort of referred to John's Swiss Army knife. So it shows that it's actually got some credence. We are, as you know, the voluntary initiative. And as Adrian will say in a moment, I think 10 or 11 years ago, probably Amenity was regarded as not being as progressive as some areas in relation to best practice. I think we've moved a great deal in those 10 years or so. And now we are very recognisable as the organisation delivering. The UK National Action Plan, which again Adrian will refer to and I will, it's under review now. But I act as that independent chairman. And I think I always use the word independent because it's important that when I talk to governments or others, I'm not speaking with any vested interest in the sector itself, but acting, if you like, in between. And that's far too busy a slide, but it's just, you will have seen this before, but again, it sort of summarises what we do, what we don't do. But the best thing to do for anybody who doesn't know too much about the forum is to go to the website, www.amenityforum.co.uk, and the other two sites, one relates to the Amenity Standard, which you'll hear about today, and the other one is Get Britain Moving, which is our public-facing site. I thought I just ought to mention this survey. Probably if you've been following social media or you've been following emails from us, if you've been following all kinds of things, you'll know that this survey is underway. The last survey was in 2016, and effectively the response was not great. Now, that I think in part was because we probably didn't get as involved as much as we have this time initially. And also the questions were very agriculturally based. And so with colleagues from CRD, and ourselves, we've worked really hard and there's been a subgroup of the forum working to try and produce something that's much, much more user-friendly. So FERA are undertaking that survey. They're particularly interested in getting responses from local authorities, the golf sector, and highways and rail, but they need responses from everywhere because it will give us a real picture of how much pesticide is being used, how it's being used, the number of staff that are being trained. So please, please do respond, because now that DEFRA are very much leading the policy side on behalf of all the national governments on the action plan, they are seeing this as really important document to give them, if you like, reassurance that what I tell them, that pesticides are very important in our sector, we can actually show it. So please do respond. And if you're not asked, you can even go to the link and you can make a response anyway. Today's event, in a moment, we're going to go to Adrian Dixon. Adrian is someone, again, I've worked with over this period that I've been chairman, and I always say we don't always agree with CRD, but we do talk to each other very well and constructively, and I think that's important. And I'm delighted that Adrian's found the time effectively to give all of these policy updates, and it really is appreciated. I'll then talk, and if you like, as always, in terms of the National Action Plan, I will then talk about the issues around us and some of the important things coming out. Given the group size, that's we'll see how we get on with the participative session, but basically we normally go into breakout groups and we may do that, but let's see how we go. And then we will have question time, which will run to about 12 o'clock. And I know Adrian has then got to leave us for another meeting, but that's fine because he'll be here to answer questions. And then we go into a presentation which has been put together from ICL with Barry Brown and Dr. Dan Jones. I'll do a quick update on the standard and then we will be finished. No presentation of mine would be complete without a quotation of some sort. My family drive my family mad with things like this, but I do think this one is particularly apt for where we are. You know, someday everything will make perfect sense. So for now, laugh at the confusion, smile through the tears, and keep reminding yourself that everything happens for a reason. And I look forward to getting to the other side of this pandemic and being able to see people again in person. So without further ado, I am now going to hand over to Adrian, who is going to run through some of the policy issues at the moment. And he doesn't like the photograph, apparently. He says it's a passport type photograph.
It's too old.
Leave it to you to talk about. Over to you, Adrian.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm Adrian Dixon. For those of you who don't know me, I head one of the two operational policy teams within HSE's Chemicals Regulation Division. So I have a team that covers legislation, stakeholder engagement, sustainable use things, amongst other things. And my colleague Grant Stark heads one on largely on evidence, new technologies and residues monitoring and committees. So it covers the expert committee on pesticides, but there is a degree of cross-working anyway. So so that's who I am. As I said, the perils of sending photos into people when they're organising conferences many years ago is that the passport photos come back to bite you. But as you can see from my image, I'm sporting the lockdown beard and haircut anyway. Next slide, please, John. So what I want to cover in a few minutes is basically to give you an update on the legal framework, particularly given that we've now got a Northern Ireland framework in the EU system and a GB framework, which is separate. Some reminders about sustainable use and the issues around there, and then a quick word around the National Action Plan, and then John will build on that from the sector perspective. Thanks, John. Next slide. Excellent, thank you. This slide may be familiar to some of you if you've been at this sort of event before. I always think it's a good way of actually showing the regulatory framework around pesticides. So down the middle you've got the pesticides life cycle, so the pre-marketing stuff, the use phase, and then disposal or degradation, what happens to pesticides in the environment. So along the left-hand side, you've got the legislation, and I'll explain a bit more about how they've been carried forward into GB national legislation, but obviously still apply to a degree in Northern Ireland under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we have the authorisation regulation covering the pre-marketing phase. We have the sustainable use legislation covering the middle bit. Down at the bottom, disposal and degradation, there is all the stuff around pesticide residue monitoring. There is the Water Framework Directive, which looks at levels of pesticides in water. There is the Waste Framework Directive, which covers how waste is disposed of, etc. And then alongside all of this, and perhaps there's the whole, how do you measure what you're trying to do, what's happening, the whole evidence question, which I touched on earlier, that Grant's team cover. And I suppose the other thing that runs alongside this as well, and it's not just solely for HSE, is the whole question of controls and enforcement, as John quite rightly highlighted. Some of that will be down to HSE, some of that will be down to local authorities, and of course in Northern Ireland that's down to HSE Northern Ireland under the instruction of colleagues from the Department of Agriculture, Environment and the Rural Affairs. And I know Bronna's on the meeting today, so it's good that she's able to participate. So that's the overall structure of the legislative framework. Next slide, please, John. And of course, in taking all this legislation that was there into a GB system and indeed separating it out for a Northern Ireland system as well, we've had to do various legislative things. We've had to change and bring into statutory instruments in GB all the previous, what was EU legislation. And we've done something which is called basically lifting and shifting with some fixes. So basically you take the EU legislation, you then change things that don't work because you're out of an EU system. So any references to EU institutions like the Commission and the European Food Standards Authority obviously don't work in a GB context, but still work in the Northern Ireland context. So we've had to make a number of statutory instruments. So this slide and the next one has a list of the main ones. As you see, we've had to make corrections to the authorisations legislation. We had to make corrections to the Sustainable Use Directive wording and how that relates to the other bits of legislation. We've had to make corrections to the maximum residue level regulations. Next slide, please, John. And then there's some wider things that we've had to do again to try and keep up with the fact that the EU system has been changing all the while that we've been doing the GB fixing legislation. So there's a number of statutory instruments there. There were, of course, various changes, some changes to the dates that we had by way of exit day, which have again had to be picked up and corrected again. And then, of course, there was the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was picked up in the last legislation to make it clear that the legislation has practical application in GB, and the EU system remains for Northern Ireland. And then, as I mentioned, the fact that the EU legislation carries on changing even after the most recent statutory instrument that was done sort of late in 2020. There will be another statutory instrument done this year. Unfortunately, the slide says next year, but that was when shows the age of the slide and I missed the correction. So that will pick up any other EU decisions that need to be brought into legislation. Next slide, please, John. From a GB perspective, we will have, we have a statutory active substance register, which you can find on our website. We're working on a GB review programme for active substances, and we have extended active substance approvals where they were due to expire before December 2023 for 3 years to give us time to bring in a GB review programme. But as the third bullet point says, we can review active substance approvals at any time should new evidence arise, or if the EU takes a decision, so that we can see whether we need to do something in GB. So that's the situation with those. Next slide, please, John. For the GB review programme, we will be looking to make sure that we can manage it and that it does what we want it to do. There are questions around how much we might want to make use of assessment by other regulators or not. There's questions around whether we might want to group actives for review by class of chemicals or things like that. So we are looking at that. Of course, the Northern Ireland regime will be still under the EU active review system, which works chronologically. So at the same time, we're operating that on behalf of colleagues in Northern Ireland. Next slide, please, John. And of course, this difference in regimes means that there'll be some difference in product applications, and we're working through the details of all of that. But for the start of existing authorisations that before the end of the transition period have been carried forward. And then once we start issuing new authorisations after the end of now that we've left the EU, we'll specify where they are valid to make it clear for people. We're having a lot of discussions internally around the whole referencing number, the map numbers on products, and how that might need to react to changes and things like that. So that's still a work in progress. And an important thing is that now that we've left the EU, applicants will require authorisation for products under both regimes to get access to both markets. We won't be changing at the minute data requirements or format for applications, and we've been carried on working on applications up to the end of the transition period as usual. Next slide, please, John. As I've just mentioned, we'll try and maintain a common map number, the reference number where we can. We will aim to allow common labelling. There may be reasons for divergence between the Northern Ireland system and the GB system, and this will impact on conditions of authorisations, data protection periods, and map numbers. But the main thing is we're trying to keep things as clear as we can for those who are using pesticides, trying to minimise the amount of label changing for those who are producing pesticides, So all of this is being taken into consideration. Next slide, please, John. So that's just a brief summary. I won't go through all of it, but the bottom line is that we've now got a GB system for England, Scotland and Wales, and we've got the NI system following the EU rules due to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And as part of that work, we have also got arrangements to be able to access the information necessary in the European system to be able to operate a system for Northern Ireland. So I think that's an important point. Next slide, please, John. Just to talk about sustainable use and give you sort of some context around that. There's obviously a whole load of domestic government strategies that feed into the context of sustainable use. Obviously, in the Northern Ireland context, there's the Northern Ireland Environment Strategy and the other government departments' different strategies that hit there. There is the wider government agendas around carbon net zero targets, biodiversity targets, and the sort of international systems that the government plays into. Next slide, please, John. What we're trying to do in the sustainable use legislation, and most of you will be familiar, but I'll repeat it just to hammer home the point. But we basically are trying to make sure that we reduce risks and impacts of pesticide use on health and the environment, promote integrated techniques where we can, whether that's integrated pest management, integrated weed management, or however we want to frame it, and get a more sustainable use of pesticides. And the legislation sets out the key areas for national actions. Next slide, please, John. Just a reminder of some of the basic requirements. At the minute, training, users have got to have specified certificates, but CPD is recommended and not mandatory, as it were. Sales of products, we've got controls to make sure that the end user holds a certificate, and distributors have certificates as well. Application equipment has to be regularly calibrated, and if you can ride on it, you must get it tested. Next slide, please, John. There are some more challenging aspects around the legislation, particularly around, how do you take reasonable precautions? What does it mean to take reasonable precautions when you're handling pesticides? And there's an emphasis around using available guidance so that you minimize use, and you've got to be able to demonstrate due diligence. There's obviously a high profile issue, I think anywhere in the UK, about the protection of water, and the need to be aware of risks to water. And again, IPM, there's the whole policy priority on IPM, of using the principles of IPM in whatever you're doing with pesticides. Next slide, please, John. This is a reminder of what the current UK National Action Plan looks like, which was published in February 2013. Next slide. And this is the priority areas that were in that National Action Plan and are still there until the next National Action Plan. So there was a heading of improving practice in the amateur and amenity sector, which I think, as John rightly said in his introduction, the amenity sector has moved on in great strides over the last few years, and we particularly value the close working that we've done in sort of discussing issues and helping draw up guidance and explaining what the rules are so that the sector can actually get out there and run with it. There's a priority area on protection of water and the difficulties of meeting water legislation. And the water issue as a whole, issue around stakeholder communication, the whole catchment sensitive farming project. And again, I think that sort of communication thing is vital and is common across all parts of the UK. And in terms of integrated approaches, there was an emphasis on pesticides being part of a range of control measures and how to maximise effectiveness of R&D. Next slide, please, John. So as John mentioned at the outset, we're nearing the end of a draft National Action Plan consultation, which has a high level aim set out there on the slide, so I won't repeat it. It's got key goals listed there, which I think John will take us through shortly anyway. Obviously, a key one from our point of view as a regulator is the continuation of robust regulation, and what does that mean? But we're also involved in all the other areas that are listed there. I think it's important to stress, as John did at the outset, that the National Action Plan consultation is UK-wide and has been developed by all 4 administrations, although it's DEFRA who are coordinating the coordinated the consultation. It is actually a UK-wide plan and has had strong input from all administrations. It's been developed to cover all pesticide users, all areas of pesticides, and the deadline for response, I know John's sort of worked on the amenity response. The deadline is just before midnight tomorrow night, so there's still time for people, if they want to do individual responses, to go onto the consultation page and fill in some answers to the questions. You don't have to answer all the questions, but as I say, I know John through other discussions has been encouraging people and companies and organisations to make their own response as well. Next slide, please, John. That's it. So that's my contact details if anybody needs to follow up anything with me. But thank you for your attention. You don't get immediate audience reactions, but you can see occasional faces anyway. But thanks for that. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I agree with you, Adrian. When you're doing it like this, you've got absolutely no idea what the response is. But thank you. That was really helpful, I think, in terms of setting that context. We're not going to take questions right now, because I think what Adrian and I found works better is if I do my bit and then questions come after that, because some of them interlink really. And as Adrian says, what I'm going to do this year is focus it around the new plan. So essentially, there is a new. The last National Action Plan was because of the Sustainable Directive, and although we're outside the EU now, or great, in the way we are as UK is, there is going to be a UK National Action Plan, and I think it is really important that I sort of pick up on some of the points in that document and say where I think we are. As Adrian says, the consultation is ongoing now until midnight tomorrow night. We have put a response in, but it is still not too late. And if you want to, it really is important as many as people as possible do make a response, simply because it illustrates how important the amenity sector is. And again, the issue around the different national governments and national administrations, and obviously in Northern Ireland, it is about the environmental strategy. So I've got to grips with virtually all these documents in some way or another. And again, it's just important to say that the National Action Plan will be on behalf of all the 4 administrations, but DEFRA is acting as the main point of contact for managing the process. So when the UK National Action Plan comes out, it is UK-wide, but inevitably it will be administered through the national governments, and therefore, again, that's why we have dialogue going with all of those in different stages. The plan itself is based on sort of what I regard as sort of 5 pillars. If this slide goes back well over a year ago, it's when I first started discussions with DEFRA, who took over the sort of policy bit to try and get my head around sort of what were the key areas they were coming through. And obviously, the first one was reducing reliance on plant protection products. Doesn't mean not using them, but reducing our reliance on them. How can we minimize? How can we more target their use? Protecting people's health, environmental protection, best practice, and monitoring use and impact. Now, again, what I would just say as well, under the environmental protection side, what's become more valid recently is to do with carbon and ensuring that we maintain or we get to the zero carbon targets. And that's quite relevant when we look at some of the methods that we use for amenity management. And the key driver priorities that run through all of these, and I think all the various strategies and documents that are around for these people, we actually have public money for public goods, environmental protection, sustainability, carbon footprinting, health and safety, and productivity. And I want you to hold on to those words as we go through, and obviously, given the pandemic, economic recovery. So basically, the plan itself, or the new reviewed plan and the document that we've got, and I have to say this document and the new plan was a lot easier to read than the last one. The last one was quite a thick document. I always say it was one of the best ways to get me to sleep on a night was to start reading it. But essentially, I've highlighted 5 main areas. First of all, ensuring robust regulation, and then you can read through. And I'm going to deal with each one of those in turn. So, ensuring continued robust regulation to protect our health and environment. Now, there's a lot of text on here. What I would say is that all these slides, all these presentations will be available after the event, after all the events are finished. And in fact, we are sort of doing an edited recording of the presentations, which we hope we can make available as well. So, but the items in red and bold to me are sort of the areas that we maybe ought to think about. First of all, they're talking about a regulatory system that is simpler for users. I'm sure you'd like that. There's innovation runs through the document. There's regulation for biopesticides. And obviously, integrated pest management runs all the way through the whole of the consultation. Now, Adrian has shown you this slide before. This is available on the website. And obviously, as he said, there is this distinction now between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But hopefully, as things move forward in discussion, we will come there. But essentially, it is important that I just sort of identify what Adrian said at the bottom there. Now, this does relate to Great Britain at this moment in time, but it says active substance approvals due to expire will be extended for 3 years. And the reason I say that is because I get quite a lot of inquiries from people who say, what about glyphosate? What is going to happen with glyphosate? And I can tell you that glyphosate, because its expiry date is before that date, it will be extended for 3 years until the 15th of December 2025 in Great Britain. And obviously, we hope that as the discussions go on in relation to how Northern Ireland and Great Britain relate in terms of these things, we very much hope it'll relate to Northern Ireland as well. But that's exactly where it is, and I think it's important people know that, unless, of course, something emerges that we don't know about. Our response to the document then, because we have put in a fairly detailed response to it, and thank you to those members who have helped and responded, helped me putting it together. We do support the idea of a rigorous and robust regulatory system. We do think that's important, but we do think it's a process that should be based on understanding the science and analysing evidence. But we make quite a point that in implementing the regulatory system, when deciding to withdraw an active or a product, the process needs to consider fully unintended consequences. Now, what do I mean by that? I think sometimes, and we've seen it, haven't we, where products are withdrawn and there's a very short withdrawal period, which gives little time for anybody to adjust to what's going there. They have still got the issues of controlling pests, whether it be or weeds or whatever, whether it be on golf greens or highways or whatever. And so what we're actually saying is, if they're not careful, that kind of process, if not managed properly, can lead to unintended consequences. People perhaps getting hold of unapproved products or other factors, because they've still got the pressures there. So we're not saying they shouldn't be withdrawn if they're obviously a danger to human health or whatever, but we're actually saying it needs to be a process. It needs to be managed, and engage, dare I say, people like the Amenity Forum in the discussions, so we can try and manage the process and not have these unintended consequences. We also obviously recognise the system costs money, but it seems to be ever escalating costs. So when I talk to manufacturers, they would say, you've got to recognise, John, that in Amenity the use might be important, but it's still less than it is in other areas such as agriculture, and therefore, as costs go up, is it really worthwhile as developing products for the Amenity sector? So we make that point in our response. And the other one that we make quite strongly is that we must review all life cycle consequences. Now, I think this really is important, because in the public debate, and sometimes public would sort of say, we've got to get rid of plant protection products, they're terrible stuff, and we'll come back to that later on. But the options available to them to replace those sort of products might actually be far more damaging to the environment or to the carbon footprinting or the sustainability. And I've used an example in London where there was a discussion with the mayor, who actually based mayor's office, where they were issuing an edict which said, we want to lose all plant protection products in terms of maintaining. And then when it was pointed out to them, the environmental and other footprinting, that was subtly changed. So I think what we're trying to say is this isn't an argument for or against. It's saying, look at all the life cycle consequences before you do it. On the topic of biopesticides, again, we are generally saying we welcome them, obviously. But again, the current regulatory system can create a somewhat grey area of biological products. And this is something we're in discussion with Adrian and his team about how we do that. We're not against them, but we're actually saying there needs to be a careful look at this. So, for example, if you have a product which has a primary purpose, which is a biological product, but that primary purpose is not about controlling weeds, pests, or diseases. It might be enhancing the soil or enhancing the turf or what have you. That is then judged on its chemical composition, and if the chemical composition is fine, it can be used. But if it has a secondary purpose, which is that, in other words, by using that product, you can control weeds, pests, and diseases in some way or another, the problem we currently have is that it doesn't fall under the PPP requirements because it's primary purpose and it's secondary. So again, I'm not arguing against those products. I'm just saying that we believe there needs to be a review there. And I know Adrian and his team agree, and it's something that's being looked at in terms of what they're doing on their very busy agenda at the minute. And then this again is a far too busy a slide, but obviously we do think that developing scientific research, we'd like to see a bit more support for research in terms of amenity. Stewardship type products, we're there. And again, I've said the particular circumstances and aspects of amenity are not always taken fully into account. So when they're looking at the dangers or otherwise or whatever, very often it starts from an agricultural focus, and then the add-ons are the amenity. And what we would argue is that you need to look at those products differently according to where they are. So it's quite important that, and I mean I could give quite a few examples of that. And I think that leads to the fourth one, where we sometimes are concerned that, as I say, it is They look at it in agriculture and then they add on for amenity, as opposed to looking at it amenity in the sense that it actually is. I mean, just as an aside, in the discussions with DEFRA, because as I say, under the new National Action Plan is being developed by DEFRA. Last time there was much more involvement of CRD in this, because CRD obviously do the regulatory side, but essentially now I've had to create links with quite a lot of new DEFRA staff, and they've been adopting this sort of team approach on looking at various topics. And, you know, I've had to go back. We've talked about my Swiss Army penknife, but go back to talk about amenity. And I think it's quite important to get them into the mindset to think of amenity as a very important area in itself, not just as an aside from. Obviously, the second thing in the consultation or core drive is support the development of IPM. Now, that was in the current plan, but that is in the new plan in spades. And so they say in the document, clearly they're going to work with stakeholders about IPM. We welcome that. And some of you responded to my call recently where the DEFRA appointed ADAS to be consultants to look at some of these activities. And some of you attended 2 workshops with DEFRA on this. So I'm really grateful, because one of the things that I've had back from DEFRA is how they found the strong voice of amenity coming through. And that really is good news. So thank you very much for that. Now, in the document, there is this diagram or the triangle. Perhaps not the other stuff, but there's a triangle. I don't like that triangle. I don't like that triangle for 2 main reasons. The first thing is at the top, it says chemical, as if chemicals are absolutely highly dangerous things. Now, all I would say to you is, you're all sat in a room, if you look at your own bodies, you look at everything, all of that is made up of chemicals. You couldn't exist without chemicals. So I'd never like that word chemical, because it does imply what I've just said. The other thing is, I don't like the triangle, because the triangle tends to indicate that chemicals are the last resort, whereas it's actually about taking an integrated approach. I prefer that. I prefer a more circular approach, because what we're aiming to do is sustainably manage pest, weeds and diseases. And we're looking at all the various ways that we can do that and getting the right combination for the right place. So I think, I've made quite a feature of that in terms of the response to DEFRA, because I think, as I say, that triangle to me does tend to not necessarily give the approach that I think we all do. The other thing I think is important is I've had to emphasize to them that many people in amenity have been doing integrated management for years. It's not necessarily such a new topic to us. Dare I say, we're much more established than agriculture in terms of a lot of these things. So again, for those who don't know, there are 3 forum documents. We used a consultant back in 2019, late 2019. There's a full guidance, there's a template, and there's a policy document. All of those are available if you email Kate. For members, all you do is you get a link and a password. If you're not a member, there is a small charge, but it is a relatively small charge so that you can access those documents. And I think they're being widely used now, and I think that's quite important. What else have we said in our response? Well, we've actually supported CPD. And I think the trouble with the current National Action Plan is that it's very vague. It says CPD is desirable. And I think that, I guess, goes back to what Adrian said about the document saying taking reasonable precautions. So if there's an incident, for example, they would ask what the CPD is, but it's only desirable. So I hope people agree, but we're actually supporting the idea of it becoming a requirement, because I think it's very important that people, we have to have a certificate as an operator to a license, but you can have that. And we had Mark Diaz from Headland speaking on Tuesday, who said he'd got one of those, but does that mean he can go back to being an operator now without any CPD? So that's there. And the other central thing, and you'll hear about this again in a minute and more, is the amenity standard. We feel the amenity standard should become a requirement, and I'll explain that a bit more, but it is central to our response. And I have to say, most of the governments and the national governments and in terms UK are very supportive of that concept. We do think that, as I say, it's important to define what integrated is. And again, the language sometimes can cause us problems. I've talked about the language of chemicals, but I've also talked about the language of alternatives. Now, I know why we use that word, but that tends to bring out the view that essentially what integrated means is looking at alternatives to it. And I don't see that. I think, as I say, it is about looking at all the tools in the box, reducing reliance on PPPs, but actually looking at all the tools and looking to see there. I mean, I had an email from one of the Scottish local authorities who's a member of the forum saying exactly that to me. He said he'd been posed a question by one of his members, which you've got to stop using glyphosate. What are the alternatives? And he was saying, let's look at what we want to achieve, because the right balance of approach. And as Adrian indicated, communication in all of this is absolutely vital, because I think that's part of the trouble. Everybody uses the word integrated or IPM in a different way, and it's really important that we recognise what it really is. Our response then is also, and again, I can quickly draft through these. As I say, the presentation will be available. There's a strong case for producing some form of financial support scheme. I do think local authorities, we all know, have been under huge pressures, not just the pandemic, but in other ways. And I think if we are going to get them and others to get involved in integrating another way, some form of help for them to develop those schemes would be really quite important. So in summary, on this section, build on the success of the forum, not just because I'm speaking, but I think it is important. I think, as I say, I think the Amenity Forum has moved to a position now of real strength because we now engage with all aspects of the amenity sector from the beginnings some years ago. We now do have the voice of all those, and even more so, people who are committed to best practice. Introducing the amenity standard as a requirement, we think that is absolutely vital. And enforcement. We feel that far too often, although there are requirements there, it can be quite difficult to enforce. Now, what do I mean by that? That's not a criticism of Adrian and his team, because if you bring a case to them, I absolutely know, they look into it and respond. But they need the resource so they can actually enforce some of these more. Because I still get people out there who say, we have seen bad practice, but does it matter because nobody seems to bother? And I think we've got to go to enforcement. So what I'm saying is this is not a criticism. It's just saying we want to work with Adrian and his team and others to see how we can strengthen that enforcement process. Ensure those who use plant protection products do so safely and sustainably is the third element of the document. So again, surprise, surprise, it talks about enhancing the system of enforcement. So we say here. It talks about the regulation side. It talks about, I think Adrian said, when you buy pesticides, the person buying the pesticide has to give the assurance that basically it's going to be used by a certified operator if it's a professional product. But there needs to be some look at that to see whether in fact those requirements are strong enough and give the sort of requirement. That's what they're saying. And they talk about working with clear partners and clear messages for amateur users. So what's our response? Well, we support stronger and more responsive, effective enforcement. I've said that already. We do, however, want to keep on bringing to mind this carbon side. Now, not just because it's something we think, but obviously the UK government is absolutely committed to zero carbon targets. And it really is important that when you look at the risks around uses of pesticides, that you do look at this sort of carbon footprinting response as well, because it is a major thrust, as I say, of UK government policy. Communication, again, something that Adrian picked up and we've put in our responses. We do think it's an issue. There are three main groups within communication. There's communication of those within the sector. Now, we like to think, the forum likes to think, it does quite a good job, but there are still hard to reach areas that we are not getting to. And it is something that we know we've got to do even more, and we want to work with the national governments and others to see how we can actually improve that side, because it's in all our interests to drive out bad practice and also to get the message out through the sector. But obviously the main forum website is the way we do that. There's the public. Now, we launched some 2 or 3 years ago, the Get Moving website. And I'm going to admit to you, I think we made a mistake, because although we produced a good website, we didn't think of the second part, was how do we get that website known and communicated? So we've gone through a complete revamp. We've revamped the Get Moving site now. It's got different types of video clips and other things. And we're also working with advisors to see how we can then increase the access to the public media. Now, clearly we have limited resource, and so we are talking to members about how they can help us with this. But we have got to get our message out there, because other groups do, dare I say, other lobby groups do. We're not a lobby group, but we need to ensure the public understand what is actually happening. And then there's the communication with those who do not sit directly within the sector, but make ultimate decisions. And that can be the national administrations, it can be the UK government, but it can also be other policymakers, members of councils and the like. So essentially, again, we're trying to spend a bit more time, and we've just got a pilot project in Cambridgeshire at the minute on working with the authority there to see how we can actually increase our messaging in relation to this, because that is absolutely important. And that thing on the right-hand side is something you hear me say time and time again. What happens in Amenity impacts on every UK citizen every day. That is rather different to the agricultural situation. What we do, whether it be public highways, and one thing that's come out of the pandemic, apart from us all learning to talk to screens and what have you, is effectively how important what you do is. Keeping the roads going, keeping the trains going, keeping the parks clean and healthy. Very, very important elements to it. And again, I make no excuses for putting a slide that some have seen before. We need to be proud of what we do. And I always keep telling people this. I know there's dangers. I know people say to me, oh yeah, but do we want to be asked questions? I think we do. If you're applying a product in a park, you're applying it, and you're applying it correctly under best practice. You're applying it for a reason. So therefore, why should you not be prepared to answer questions if people ask you? Because you're doing the right job. And I think, again, we don't always help ourselves by not being proud of what we do. I've mentioned the immunity standard. Why is this so important? Well, the immunity standard is important because it basically is going to be our red tractor, if you like. I'm looking forward to the day when I can go into a public park, or I can tune into the Ryder Cup or whatever, and I can see the immunity standard on the tee box or whatever it is, because it demonstrates that whoever is responsible for that amenity space is actually a member of an approved assurance scheme. This amenity standard is not a scheme, it's nothing at all. It's just a demonstration that the people who are responsible are members of an approved assurance scheme and therefore are operating at professional standards. If I appoint an electrical contractor, I ask to see whether they are approved. Why shouldn't I ask the amenity operator? And again, I've said this at all the presentations, but it's true. I know a lawn care business, maybe do my lawn, who arrived with a van, and on the van side was the amenity standard logo. Obviously, I was impressed, but then I said to the lad, "You know what that is?" And he actually knew. He said, "That demonstrates I'm a professional, I'm fully trained, and I'm doing things in the right way." So it is important, we believe, to drive forward on the standard. We're getting a lot of traction from national administrations and the UK government on this. They like it. And I know this is a Northern Ireland event, but if I can tell you that the minister in Scotland and in Wales have written out to local authorities indicating they should be looking for the standard, I think it really is important that we do that. There's this requirement for CPD, which I'll be interested to see whether you support, but we certainly do. As I say, I know I'm repeating things, but again, we believe a targeted campaign of infection might help. I think I'm right that in mainland Ireland, they were quite concerned a year or two ago that they weren't getting enough sprayer testing. So they did a targeted campaign. And dare I say, they highlighted one or two places where that hadn't happened. And lo and behold, there was a real rush for people to get their sprayers tested. So I think sprayer testing is important. I think the amenity sector has responded, as Adrian said, anything you can sit on. If anybody can come up with a better definition, we don't know, but we talk about if your feet are off the ground. And the response has been good, but the reality is there are still, in our view, sprayers out there. And also we've highlighted in our response that although it says you don't need to have it tested until it's 5 years old, there are new sprayers that are coming into the country which possibly would not meet the standard. And again, that's something that needs to be looked at. Then there's the whole question of amateur. Again, we're talking to DEFRA and others about how maybe the Amenity Forum can even more embrace amateurs. We have people like the RHS and others, a National Garden Centre scheme or something, who are involved with us. But it's really important because there are issues there which are highlighted in the consultation. If I go into my local Dobbies down the road and I pick up Roundup or something off the shelf, and I go to the counter and say, "Can somebody advise me about this?" And I've tried this, by the way. They actually say, "Well, we'll have to ring head office." Now, to me, that's not good enough. There needs to be somebody there who can give that. And equally, I would suggest that perhaps if I buy that, somebody asks me the question, do I know what I'm buying? Do I understand what it's for? Because again, I've used this anecdote before, but it's true. I have allotments behind my house, behind my garden, and I actually have the allotment behind my garden, which is even better. But one of the allotment holders there, the other day, I was having discussions with him, and he said to me, "I think this glyphosate, it's dreadful, isn't it?" And I said, "But didn't I see you spraying around your allotment the other day?" And he said, "Oh yeah, but that's Roundup." So again, he wasn't educated because he didn't know that what he was using was the subject he was trying to lobby to get banned. And I think there ought to be some kind of amnesty scheme, because if you look, and again, I know you look at allotment sheds, the stuff there, and people, it's easy to criticise them for disposing of things wrongly, but if we don't give them the guidance and help, how can they actually do it? Beg your pardon, I'm going too quick. Set targets to support reduction of risks. Well, this one is all about their targets. Again, we're involved with working groups, and I've been involved with, because quite a lot of the targeting at the minute does tend to be agriculturally focused. So again, I'm all for targets, and one of the things that we do as a forum is every year we produce an annual report which we present to show how the sector's responding to the plan. But essentially, again, we'd like harder targets, but they need to be targets that are understandable and actually give the right information, not necessarily just agriculturally focused. Because we're up for inspection, but we need to know how we do it. And then the final area is ensuring effective work with others to deliver the goals. Now, this is something that I've worked on quite hard. I think I'd be right to say that although we've tried quite hard, we haven't always worked as closely with the voluntary initiative for agriculture as we should. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, but they've got a new chairman now, and I can report that we, first of all, we get on really well, and we work together well. And so we're now have agreed that we're going to meet on a quarterly basis and discuss items of interest to both of us, because I think it really is important. I think for too long, we've been two separate bodies, and yet actually we need to increase the voice through. And I think that's really important. And as I say, we are in discussions, both of us, with the amateur sector to see how we can embrace them. Because what we want to be able to show is that the sector is up for the challenge. It can deliver on these targets. It is the bodies to do it, but we've got to work together. And I've had discussions with NFUs, AICs and others about working in partnership together, because I think that's really important. So I think I'm just about there. Again, just to put that last slide on, because I think it really is important. And it's sort of something that I always come back as a touchstone for where we want to be. So I forgot. I don't think we need to bother with that. So I think I've come to the end of what I've said. Adrian has put forward his presentation as well. Now, is Kate on the line?
Yeah, I'm here.
Kate, are we going to go into breakout groups? Can you do that?
I can do 2 groups, John, if you'd like me to.
Right. So, given the numbers, we're going into breakout groups, and we're going to go into a breakout group for 20 minutes, which is about giving you time to have a discussion and also to do anything else that you might decide after 15 minutes you're going to have a break for a drink or whatever. But the reality, in 20 minutes time, so any minute now, Kate will put you into those, and then in 20 minutes time, she'll take you automatically out. What I'd like you to do is elect somebody in your group who can act as the spokesperson, and then come back to me with up to 3 issues, key issues that you think are really important going forward. I've put their email as well, because if anybody on the call wants to email as well, it really is helpful to me. I sometimes, and particularly now, given where we've been for the last 12 months, I spend a lot of my time sat up here in my office, and I don't, it really is important that I get your views. And although you can use calls like this, it's often very important for you to tell me as well. So what we're going to do is 20 minutes. You're going to go offline into your groups. By the way, you don't need to do anything. You'll just be taken off. And if you can then spend some time on those, and then we'll come back. I'll ask the two spokespeople to respond, but also if there are any questions, Adrian and I are available to answer those. As I say, Adrian's got to go at 12, which is fine, but we will get through them by then. So, Kate, I think now you can perform the magical trick.
I will.
Right. It is, as I say, a relatively small number this time. So who was the other group? Who was the spokesperson for the other group?
No, I volunteered to do it, John, so I can run
Adrian,
through.
Adrian can start then.
And I mean, those who were in the group will no doubt chip in when I've run through things, but and some of the themes were very much around similar to type of things we've heard at previous meetings. So, for example, the whole public perception, communication with the public, particularly around glyphosate and things like that, as you raised in your presentation, John. The whole question around the amenity standard of, how do you get sort of encourage or increase awareness of what it actually means. I gave the example of the sort of checker trade type of advert. How do you get that message out, particularly when local authorities are still sort of very much cost based, and post COVID will probably be even more cost conscious of things. So there was that sort of issue there. Mark Pyra raised a concern around the use of agricultural chemicals in amenity, which I think is always the sort of question. And I mean, it does raise the question of some things you need a mixture of controls between sort of proactive stuff and reactive stuff, but some of these things are very difficult to pin down, really. And I mean, the other thing that I raised was the whole sort of question, and others did, around sort of chemicals have the appropriate place, and it's explaining that to people about getting the balance right of things, and what you are trying to do with things. So I mean, I think those were the main points I picked up. But as say, Ivor and John Shufflebottom and Mark Pyra, if he's able to communicate but was having to communicate by chat, might want to add to any of those. John, thanks.
I think the thing on the use of agricultural, it comes back to the point on unintended consequences, because it's a difficult one, because if you are in an amenity area and you lose a product that you can use, there'll always be a tendency to look at something else, which obviously they shouldn't be doing. But what I'm saying is there. And I think the other thing, dare I say, to the group is it comes back to this issue about enforcement and why we've got to embrace the amenity standard, because I think we've got to drive out that bad practice, because it doesn't help anybody in our sector. And I suppose the final thing I'd say is we had a discussion with the lawn care group recently, and obviously they've got real issues around chafer and leather jacket damage on lawns, and they've now got customers coming back to them and saying, well, if you can't get a chemical, we've been on the website and we can get hold of this thing from, say, America, which it says it'll control it, and it's a real balancing act here, because obviously we can't not say professional standards, but there are those pressures which are those unintended. Mark, you raised the issue, so do you want to sort of expand on it at all?
He was having communication problems at the time in the group.
Oh, right, sorry. Yeah.
I mean, one point I would make on the internet stuff, John, which is more of a sort of caution against generalizing too much, is that although people can see things on the internet sometimes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can actually get them.
Yeah, I know.
So there is this sort of thing of, well, this is available on the internet.
Yeah.
It may not be available on the internet. Yeah. So I think it doesn't sort of reduce sort of issue, but it does sort of temper it. I think, John.
And to be fair to your team, I mean, whenever anything happens responded on this, you do act, because we've got various members who do.
Yeah, I mean, the enforcement people have done an awful lot of work and have very good relations with the big internet sellers, and are very good at sort of pursuing sort of, and getting things taken down and things like that. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that there isn't sort of more work that can be done with it. But like you say, and I think, as you mentioned, there is a sort of an enforcement mailbox, and if people, certainly for GB, I mean, obviously Bronner would need to explain what happens in NI, but for GB, if there are things that people spot, there is a place that they can send them to. But as I say, Northern Ireland enforcement isn't CRD's, HSE's job.
No,
unfortunately. So we stop at the water.
No. Right, Rachel, I've given you plenty of time, because William is around, but he's disappeared for some reason. So are you able to sort of just, I mean, we had a discussion primarily about this problem of authorization between, is that right?
Yeah, so the discussion, I mean, we had a very small group, but the discussion, like John was sort of primarily around sort of the authorization and diversions between NI and GB, and what will happen when that starts to happen, which inevitably it will be, with NI obviously having to follow EU and GB having their own. We are trying to think what. See, put me on the spot, and I can't remember really what we discussed. I didn't take notes.
He was expecting a quiet morning this morning, John. He's ruined her plans for the day.
Rachel's worked with me before. She knows I always do this. I think it was just interesting, because I did come into that group, and I think it was this discussion around, you're all challenged with actually how we deal with pesticide regulation going forward, but this extra complexity, and I think William was saying he operates through distributors across the UK and Ireland as well, and he was sort of just saying that clearly it's quite an issue on how that's going to emerge. But to be honest, as from the Northern Ireland side, and we had yourself there, there are no clear answers yet. I think that's what was sort of coming out of our discussion.
No, I think this is the point that we touched on the other day, that and it's an issue for GB as well, is the whole sort of how burdensome the process is or isn't. For manufacturers, etc., may have an influence then on whether they bring things to GB or bring things to Northern Ireland or whatever. So it is a point that we're extremely mindful of, because the market changes if you suddenly have to pay a small fortune for getting an additional authorization. And I think that's the point, really, isn't it?
I mean, Barry, you operate, ICL operates across the whole piece. What do you see that as an issue for ICL?
In terms of trying to control what's on some shelves, and what we class as professional, we try to toe the line as the rest of you do. We do get faced with it, but our hands are tied by certain things, because going back to like the chafer grub, that people say, no, I can get it online. Well, we get the same thing. It's like, well, can I just use this, or can I use it first? Well, if it's not on the label, no, you can't.
Yeah.
We know pretty well you probably will, but we can't say that. We're not allowed to say that, and we've got to follow the letter. We do come up against it all the time, and sometimes it does hamper some of the relationships, or it will hamper a sale every now and again. But we've got to be towing the line, because it's the right thing to do every time.
Yeah, I mean, and again, Adrian, I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, because as I say, it's an area I know we're all looking at, but it is this issue around products, as I said earlier on, that have got a primary purpose, but then can have a secondary impact, and how we work our way through that. Because I do know for people like ICL, for example, it can be an issue to them, where somebody says, well, actually, yeah, but I've got this product and it kills all the earthworms or whatever it is, so therefore why don't you use that? And as Barry would say,
yeah, I mean, some of the biostimulant stuff, as opposed, I mean, we need to sort of make sure we're clear between the difference between the biopesticide,
yes,
which is
yeah,
actually approved under the regime,
yes,
etc.,
yeah,
and the biostimulant. Some of the biostimulants problems will be addressed depending on how the fertilizer regulations are implemented, because that actually picks up a whole pile of stuff around biostimulants, which is the sort of stuff, as you mentioned, that we used to loosely refer to as grey products, as it were. But I mean, the bottom line is, if something is advertised as having a plant protection product claim, then it has to go through an authorization process as a plant protection product. But like you say, it's these things that helps plant growth and fights such and such a thing, but isn't actually saying it kills it or whatever, that start getting into sort of the dubious label claims. But as I say, some of that will be clarified by the sort of how the fertilizers regulations that came in last year have been implemented in another bit of DEFRA, who again we talk closely to.
Yeah. And I guess the other question I would ask is, and please, if anybody else wants to, is again, we mentioned this, that DEFRA are acting as the body to pull together the plan. Do you foresee, Adrian, any issues, or how it's going to, when the is it are each of the national administrations going to implement it differently, or do you see it as something that's going to be a UK wide?
I think as before, I think as we said, all the departments, Bromers and others, have had input into it, and I think it provides a framework, because it's never going to stop individual administrations doing what's appropriate for their area. And I mean, in the original Sustainable Use Directive sort of wording and the negotiations, it was quite clear that you wanted to have regional elements if necessary. I mean, when you look at at countries like Germany, well, it has a national action plan and it's got however many lender, so I think it's getting things at the right level, being united where you need to be united, but different where you've got something that's appropriate to be different. I think that's the critical thing, really. But I think everybody's trying to go in the same direction. It's just some of the detail of what they might want to do or need to do to get there it might be slightly different in each of the sort of territories, as it were.
Okay, good. Any other points that people haven't been able to make? I can see Ivor on there. Is there anything you wanted to make, Ivor, or anybody else really? That's if not, I will now hand over to Barry to take the presentation forward. Is that right, Barry?
Okay, so this is a little bit of a tag team presentation between myself and Dr. Dan Jones. The first part is quite light. It will just give you a background of partly who we are for those that don't know, but also how we got to where we are with our announcement of this guide that's going to come out, which Dan will touch on in a little bit more detail. But before I continue, I just want to say thank you to Amenity Forum, to Kate and John for pulling all this together, and for Adrian for his presentation, and everyone taking part today. It would be nice to meet everyone face to face. I think we're all a bit beyond Teams and Zoom calls at the minute. Some face-to-face interaction would be quite nice. But being able to update everyone and keep the communication going, be it online, I think is quite important. So for John and the team to pull this together has been fantastic. So thank you on that part. So ICL. So you may or may not know who we are. So we are specialists. We work in the formulation and development of liquid and fertilizer products within the UK for 4 main sectors. It's sports turf, so all the high-end arenas that you see and that type of thing. Landscape amenity, which I head up as the sales and industrial manager myself. Horticulture, and then specialty agriculture. And that's the main bodies within the UK. If you step further afield and you go global, which ICL is, then it diversifies even more. We also have a mine up near Whitby, up north, which pulls polyhalite out of the ground, which is an organic mineral. And we are probably we are the only mine in Europe, if not the world, that pulls this product out of the ground, and it's quite a revolutionary product. You may well have heard of it, but that's ICL in a nutshell, because we're here today to talk about this new step following on from last year's invasive formulas. But how we got to where we are today in terms of this new guide, which Dan is going to take you through, it was because of COVID we got to this point. What, 12, 13 months ago now, everything changed for the worse, predominantly, with a lot of us coming out of it stronger. We're more resilient. Technologies have moved on. We ourselves, if you asked us 14, 15 months ago, would we have a product on the market for sanitization, for surface and hand sanitizers, alcohol-free residual sanitizer? No, we wouldn't, but COVID came along and we started to do that. We brought that to the market. Everything's changed. We now have a sanitizer product as well. Social distancing become a thing. Working from home or living at work, depending on what mood you're in and how you see and how long you've been locked down, that's a thing now. Having a meeting where at some point, and John demonstrated it beautifully this morning before we all went on live this morning, was predominantly most meetings at some point will have the sentence "you are on mute" involved as well. So everything changed, and we've seen everything change with that. But last year, you may not or may not be aware that we brought out a series of webinars just to keep the communication going, to give something back to people that were having to work from home, to keep CPD and basis points going as well, and just share some of the knowledge and technology that we have. So we brought out 4 invasives, invasive science light we called them, and they were webinar invasive series. You may well have attended them, and if you did, thank you very much. For those of you that couldn't, you can still see them online, and if you drop me a line, my details are at the end of the slide, I'll send you the links to where they are online and you can watch them as well. But for those that are quite good at weed identification, you should have had time now to look at the images and basically identify what the webinars are about. And it was Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam and giant hogweed, rhododendron buddea, and then the last one we did just before Christmas was focusing on native invasive species for UK and Ireland. And it was these invasive conferences, these webinars that we did online, that sort of changed our focus and gave us this idea to bring this publication out. But it wasn't what we were presenting, the technology, the chemicals or anything like that. It was more the questions and the interaction we were getting during the Q&A on screen, but also subsequently follow-up questions, people emailing us, contacting us and asking more in depth. A lot of it was about the weed species, more in-depth analysis about the weed species, but also environmental or scenario-based considerations. They had a particular project that they had to work around and how best to do it. So it wasn't a case of just reading the back of the label, it was actually what other considerations do you have on site? And that's all of that in-depth communication, all of those in-depth conversations led to Dan and ourselves having a conversation. And we decided to put together a guide that Dan will take you through very shortly. And we're in the process of just putting all the information together. And it will go into an awful lot more detail. It will give you, not the ammunition, but it will give you another string to your portfolio. And what John was saying earlier on about using products more responsibly, use less is more, a targeted approach. This will fall into that armory and it will give you more ability. It will give you the ability to speak to your client as well and explain your rationale behind why you're doing things, or perhaps when they've asked you to hand pull something, well, in reality, it's not probably the best way to do it. And it will give you the information behind that answer and the technology and the science behind that as well. So hopefully it will become a very rounded, useful document for you all. But it very much spawned off the back of these conversations that we're having, off the back of the Q&A for these invasives as well. If you've got any questions for this, obviously you can contact Dan and Kate directly and they'll send your questions to us. My contact details are on the screen very, very briefly for you here. If you can take a snapshot or you can screen print it if you want. I'll hand over to Dan now, who will go through the guide that we're putting together in a little bit more detail. This will be published, and it will be released for everyone to get a copy of should they want to do it, to review it as well and have a bit of a read, and almost keep it on the shelves as a sort of a reference tool. And we're trying to aim it as a reference tool. It's not going to be a science tool. It's going to be a reference tool that you can call on and use. So if I hand over to Dan now, if I stop sharing my screen, I'll let you share your screen, Dan, and Dan will now take you through more of the information that the document will hold, how we're planning on laying it out, and the rationale about why we're laying it out the way we are. Once again, thank you to John and Kate and to all of you being here. Any questions, my details on the screen. Dan, I will hand over to you, my friend. I'll speak to you shortly.
Thank you very much, Barry. Yeah, so Barry touched on what we're hoping to, well, what we will be putting together this year. And I'll bring up the presentation now to kind of run through cover some of the rationale that Barry was discussing, but also kind of emphasize some of the approaches and the overall sort of development of the guide in itself, in order that it becomes the appliance of science, like a useful document that, you know, when you've got an early start in the morning, you're able to reference the relevant page and get to work. So in terms of what I'm presenting today, we're actually looking at a range of different invasive plants, but crucially, it's about doing more with less. And this is something that's coming up with the sustainability agenda increasingly. But I think the really useful science that has been done has demonstrated that we can use less herbicides, less labour to achieve better results. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. Bear with us. We've had a bit of a disaster with the slides here. So in terms of what advanced invasives does, we solve invasive plant problems for those of you that haven't been to any of the presentations. And we work in 6 key areas. So the ones that are relevant to us today is research and testing, site survey, strategy, and also some public guidance work. In terms of the business itself, Complete Weed Control and Swansea University funded my PhD studies that started back in 2011. They concluded in 2016, and from there, Advanced Invasives and our R&D offer AI Lab started. In terms of what we do, we're quite unique. The kind of key piece of evidence that was released into the public domain was the knotweed papers. That was the world's largest knotweed field trial, and that was released back in 2018. There's been quite a few publications since then, but that makes us quite unique in what we can offer to our clients. There's no comparable organisation of its kind in Europe. In terms of the background to this, Barry touched on this, but we did this series of webinars, and well, they were very well received, but I think the kind of key take-home message, certainly from a personal point of view, was that you can always learn more about how to do things better. So although we've got the, well, Advanced Invasives got this research and development element to the business, there's a real gap in knowledge between what scientists do and what people are actually doing out in the field. And I think, you know, one of the key things was that we got some really useful stuff from Brian Taylor in particular around how ragwort is toxic to cattle and the process by which this happens. We've got some good questions from Al Mason. And what we were trying to think about was, well, you know, we're getting good feedback. There's practical understanding that, you know, we need to take into account as we understand how to manage these weeds. So can we link the R&D to the practical implementation of weed management in order to get better results and fundamentally to improve weed management for all of those involved in the process? In terms of development of the guide, the discussions were ongoing last year, and we're very much in the game with this at the moment. So I think usefully, you know, it's, well, uniquely, it's evidence-based. So all of our recommendations are going to be based on good science, but there's also this solutions-focused approach that we're developing at the moment in order that that research, which at times can be quite complicated, becomes a useful resource that can be easily understood when you're out on site. And also, we're going to provide some background information. So in the round, it's going to provide the information that you and your clients need. I think one of the things that often gets missed in the discussions around invasive plants is that there's native and there's also invasive species. Now, generally, invasive plants often need to be managed to minimise ecological and socio-economic impacts. And things like giant hogweed also have a range of human health impacts. And because of the way that they grow, whether that's annual species that produce a lot of seeds or rhizome-forming species like knotweed, it can be quite difficult to manage these plants, and particularly invasive non-native plants. So in terms of the two main types that we're going to be looking at, we've got our UK native invasive weeds, such as horsetail, and then your sort of more commonly encountered in INNPs. So those are from other parts of the world, so things like Japanese knotweed. And because these plants are introduced from other parts of the world, and they often don't have their diseases and herbivores or predators around, it means that they're often more difficult to manage. So although UK native invasive weeds are very difficult to manage in themselves, the invasives are often a little bit trickier. And in terms of how we're going to address this, they're all difficult to manage. There's not a great deal of good quality information out there. So what we're going to do is draw together the existing evidence, new evidence that we're developing on an ongoing basis to provide that to end users. So just to cover the four most commonly encountered or regularly encountered in discussions, you've got your Japanese knotweed at left, you've got rhododendron, which is continuing to cause problems and is quite expensive to manage in upland areas, giant hogweed in the top right, and then your Himalayan balsam down in the bottom right. Now, I'm going to try and emphasize some of the commonalities here. So you've got your rhizome-forming species at left, you've got your woody shrubs in the top left with the rhodie, biennials in the top right, and then your annuals down in the bottom right corner. And when you think about native plant species, these kind of life history traits are really important to understand in terms of managing both your invasives and also your native plants. You've got woody trees, shrubs like your sycamore in the left. You've got native hogweeds, again, biennial, perennial, and then your rhizome-forming species like your bindweed that you can see at right, and then willow herbs that are annuals. And what we're trying to do is draw together our understanding of life cycle events, how these plants grow in order to find common approaches that are also subdivided out based on experimental data and understanding of practical implementation of control. So in short, although there's quite a lot of complicated information going into this guide, overall what we're aiming for, and this is novel, unique, it's not been done before, is a functional approach to invasive plant management, and that covers your natives and your non-natives. And what we're going to do is focus on life cycles and growth characteristics. So you've got annual, perennial, woody shrubs and trees. Further to that, there's a bit more complexity than that. You've got things like rhododendron that have got particular growth characteristics, waxy leaves in that case. And what we're going to aim to do is provide species-specific advice that will enhance management of those problematic species. And for each of the 20 invasive weed profiles that we're going to cover, we're going to provide background information as well, so that when you're out on site with a client or you're writing up a report, you've got authoritative information to support what you're going to be providing to the client. So in terms of the plant profiles themselves, we're already well underway with this. We've got species introductions, so key ID features, just in case you're in doubt or your client's in doubt about what they have. We've also got an identification guide that helps you to understand what similar species look like and how to discriminate between the two. You've got your region of origin, introduction history that can be useful, particularly when you're working with ecologists and things like that, because they're interested in the general biology of the plant. The biology and ecology of the plants is also crucial. You know, when you think about managing things like balsam, hogweed, you know, biosecurity is absolutely critical because you can spread the seeds off site very easily. And also, and this comes back to the sustainability and environmental considerations, you know, the impacts and costs associated with management. Sophie Hocking presented at the Amenity Forum conference and just highlighted how there's a drive towards non-chemical weed control, but often some of the environmental considerations around that, particularly carbon emissions, they're not really considered, and it needs to be understood when you're discussing why you're focusing on herbicide-based management as opposed to cutting things down, for example. In terms of the management overview, we'll provide all of the treatment options available and also provide an integrated weed management system recommendation approach to how best to manage these under real-world conditions. In terms of what we'll be doing with the IWM approach is evaluating based on the data, your cultural, preventative, physical methods, biological control where these exist, your chemical or PPP, herbicide control-based approaches, and also your IWM system, so full integration of the above three methods. And I think really fundamentally, it's about doing more with less, particularly of the right thing. And I think the research around Japanese knotweed was really handy in demonstrating how we really can achieve this in a sustainable way. So in terms of the approach, this is a simplified diagram of how we'll be producing flow diagrams that will be accessible. And I do speak from experience, trying to make decisions at 4 AM when you're just about to tackle a large patch of knotweed or another complicated invasive plant with rain forecast can be quite challenging. We'll be taking a look at the practical constraints around use near water, should you be using a product around trees, and also product volumes. You know, are you going to get better results with low water volumes? And in terms of how we'll address things from a practical approach is looking at key scenarios, so full details of the 5 commonly encountered management scenarios to bring together the biology of the target weeds with effective control methods. So optimizing the approach for each of the different weeds considered. And coming back to this again, I always bring this slide up, but we can do more with less. So right treatments, right time, doing more with less, and just understanding that weed management is often a long-term process, and really we're in for the long haul. And as long as our clients understand the constraints, the problems around managing these species, we really can deliver better results in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. And Dan, thank you for all the work you do. I remember you coming to the Amenity Forum conference quite a few years ago as a research student and everything else. And I think what you've done since has been amazing. So thank you very much for your contribution to the sector. And as I say, thank you to Barry and the team at ICL who support the forum in so many ways. Are there any questions that people have? I can't always see everybody on the screen, but if there are, I'll go quiet for a few seconds just in case. I know that both of the speakers will be more than happy to answer any comments anywhere by email or whatever after the event. Okay, well, I think that's been really helpful. And as Barry said, thank you to himself and to others. But what I just wanted to do was, before I let you go, for just for a few minutes, I want Kate to play a video clip which was recorded once lockdown started last year. I say to everybody, I've learned so many new skills. I'm sure everybody else has, really. And this was one of my earlier attempts at a video clip, but it was about assurance and amenity standard, and I think it is quite an important clip just to play, and then we'll all go off and to our daily lives. But I think Kate's able to do it because she's very good at magic. I'm continuing my series on the ongoing review of the National Action Plan being undertaken by national governments. The topic this time is assurance. Some of the key policy drivers influencing the National Action Plan review are illustrated here. And in this series, based on these, I've identified some key areas for our consideration, and these are shown on the following slide. It is important that as a sector we discuss matters arising from these issues as a means of both inputting into and/or influencing the review process. This time, my focus is on assurance. The pandemic has changed all our lives and created many personal tragedies. As we emerge from it, we have a really challenging time. What is clear is that we have a public now with a heightened awareness of health and safety. More than ever, they will seek assurances that practices meet legal and best practice requirements. This is certainly true in terms of amenity management. We need, as a sector, more than ever, to demonstrate our professionalism and full commitment to best practice at every level. Following its introduction at our 2019 conference, the Amenity Standard was formally launched earlier this year. It is similar to the Red Tractor Standard in food and agriculture. Those operating to the standard and displaying its logo will demonstrate their adherence to recognised assured standards in all tasks undertaken. Those making use of organisations and bodies holding the standard will be assured of professional levels of operation. The introduction of the standard has had enthusiastic support and backing from DEFRA and all UK national governments. This slide sets out the key purpose of the standard. It is a standard designed to cover all our important and diverse sector. It will be managed, certainly initially, by the Amenity Forum, who will audit assurance schemes brought forward to be part of the standard, to ensure that they meet requirements and provide assurance of professional levels of operations and adherence to best practice. Organisations who wish to hold the standard will need to be a member of an approved assurance scheme and fully support the objectives of the Amenity Forum. The Forum will cover its costs of audits from fees paid by the assurance scheme bodies. Currently, 3 assurance schemes have initially met the audit and are recognised: Amenity Assured, Lawn Assured and the PCA Invasive Weeds Management Scheme. However, more are currently being developed and considered to ensure full coverage of the sector and all its bodies. In summary, the Amenity Standard is a bespoke quality management standard developed in partnership by all sides of the sector and managed and audited by the Amenity Forum. We believe that the Amenity Standard can provide appropriate assurance of the sector's commitment to best practice and give the public and key stakeholders a clear way of ensuring operations meet legal requirements and provide the appropriate assurance to the public on health and safety standards. It is vital that all operating in the sector fully support this and get involved. If you are an organisation wishing to operate at the standard and want more information on how, or would like to put forward or develop an appropriate assurance scheme to meet the requirements of the standard, please contact Steve as shown, and for all other inquiries contact Kate at the Amenity Forum office. Going forward, we know how tough it will be as we seek to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. What happens in Amenity impacts upon every UK citizen every day, and we need to ensure that all who operate in amenity management do so at the highest standards and can demonstrate it. The public and policymakers need assurance. Members of the Forum committed to best practice can deliver this, and widespread adoption and acceptance of the standard can ensure not only further increases in standards, but overall public confidence in our sector. Thank you. Thanks for that. You saw the hairstyle as well. You can see it was in lockdown, couldn't you? Just in terms of that, we do have an Amenity Forum YouTube site which has got quite a lot of video clips on. And just as a sort of slight amusing tack, just to say that my grandson the other day came rushing in to say basically, Grandad, you're a YouTuber, and I didn't know what he meant, but apparently he'd found one of the videos on that. He didn't understand what was on the video. He just was very impressed that I was on YouTube. Right, I think, what I should just say on the standard, just so you're aware, there are two other schemes that have now been externally audited and approved. One is for greenkeeping, golf greenkeeping, and one is for sports surfaces, both of which are backed by bigger and the organisations there. So GMA. So essentially, we now cover the whole areas. The golf and the sports one will be formally launched in a few months, but obviously, given where we are with the pandemic, we've not done it. So thank you very much indeed. As I said, it was a select group today, but I'm sure everybody who's been on it has benefited from it. So again, our last one is on Thursday next week. And although it's got a Scotland focus, you're very welcome to attend, so spread the news. And thank you again. Thanks to all our presenters, and we will see you again soon. Take care.
If anybody wants to claim basis points, if you email me with your name and number, I'll add you to the register.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thank you, Kate, for all your magic. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. See you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.